Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Painting any era with a single broad brush, let alone allowing an underground or countercultural movement to be the sole defining historical memory of an era, is totally insincere. And indeed, there are moments in history where cultures do clash within a single society, not necessarily because of race or ethnicity or religion, but because of age. The 1920s was such an era when the old world that was still very much holding on to the optimism of 19th century values was clashing with a generation that had just gotten out of the worst war of all time and had very different cultural, musical, costumery values. The 1960s was a similar era. It began with all the optimism of the 50s, and with that, it began with the great cultural icons of the 50s riding high. It ended as a decade where a president, a senator, two civil rights leaders, well, frankly, more, were all assassinated, and young men were being drafted in to fight a war in Vietnam. And the music reflected both sides of those cultural realities and did so, frankly, throughout the decade. Proof positive of this is that in 1966, the album, the year that Pet Sounds was released, the year that Frank Zappa's Freak Out was still on the charts, albeit among underground audiences, the year that the Beatles and Rolling Stones were pushing various boundaries, a number one album was Frank Sinatra's Strangers in the Night. And Sinatra was obviously someone who dominated the 40s and 50s, but people forget he also dominated the 60s with a lot of hit songs and a lot of hit albums. And every time they tried to write the chairman of the board off, he would come back and surprise them with another hit album and another hit song. And of course, My Way, by some estimations, his most endearing hit came right at the very end of the decade. So people who only paint the 60s as sort of the era of long hair and hippies, that was only part of the culture. And it was certainly the most important part for not all, but many young people. But for people in their 30s and older, Strangers in the Night was really where it was at. And again, I've said it before, I'll say it again, and this is controversial among certain Sinatra lovers. I think that the reprise era, the 60s and 70s era of Sinatra, was his finest era. Such lush and wonderful and diverse arrangement. So many great and iconic songs that were one part traditional, one part modern. And Strangers in the Night as an album, I think, really captured all of this. Strangers in the Night was, for traditional pop music of its era, a very forward leaning, very modern, and perfect song. Again, it was one of these songs that was perfect, and the entire album was just a really, really good album. It was wonderfully produced by pardon me, by Jimmy Bowen, recorded at the Great Western Recorders, and Nelson Riddle orchestrated. You had Summer Wind, All or Nothing at All, the up-tempo version. On a Clear Day, You Can See Forever, a great version of that, a great version of Downtown, and a great version of The Most Beautiful Girl in the World. Just so many great tracks on this album. And when you look at the albums that hit number one in 1966, you see that there was, frankly, more popularity among musicians that you would tend to put on the more traditional side than the modern side. You had several number ones by Herb Alpert. You had Whipped Cream and Other Delights. You had Going Places, one of my favorite Herb Alpert albums. And you had a third, What Now, My Love, another great. So Herb Alpert was dominating. Sinatra had a number one. The Sound of Music soundtrack and the Dr. Zhivago soundtrack were top sellers. But then you also had Pet Sounds, the best of the modern, if you ask me, Aftermath by the Rolling Stones, both Revolver and Rubber Soul by the Beatles. And so this paints, I would say, a much more accurate picture of the era than if you just were to say, oh, it's all about hippies and counterculture. It was also about Frank Sinatra and Herb Alpert and the soundtracks that were written in some cases by Rodgers and Hammerstein, people that were much more, you would find their soundtracks on a shelf next to Sinatra's generally more frequently than you'd find some of the more modern stuff. But like I said, it was a decade when the young and the old both had their own musical cultures, and who's to say which one really was more dominant? Depends who you ask. As always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.